Hello, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in for Deborah Sampson Unveiled, a virtual conversation, co-presented by the American Repertory Theater at Harvard University and the Museum of the American Revolution. I'm Sarah Schofield-Mansur. I use the she, her series of pronouns, and I'm the Assistant Director of Special Events and Partnerships at the A.R.T. A little bit about the A.R.T. for those of you who may not have visited us before. The A.R.T. is a leading force in the American theater, producing groundbreaking work that is driven by risk-taking and passionate inquiry. Under the leadership of Diane Paulus as the Terry and Bradley Bloom Artistic Director and executive producer Diane Boyger, A.R.T. seeks to expand the boundaries of theater by programming transformative theatrical experiences, always including the audience as a central partner. A.R.T. is committed to a long-term process of centering anti-racism in its practice, policies, culture, and pedagogy, governments, and organizational structure. And if you're unfamiliar with our work, I invite you to visit our website, AmericanRepertoryTheater.org. It'll also be dropped in the chat. And check out some of our upcoming online events and other offerings, including our first ever virtual spring celebration scheduled for June 5th of this year. At A.R.T., we are so looking forward to being able to safely bring live performance back to our stages. And you can see some snippets of our previous work on the slide carousel being shown by my colleagues at the museum. And we are very excited about our upcoming production of the Tony Award-winning musical, 1776. Looking towards that show, all of us at the theater are so thrilled to be co-presenting this amazing event with the Museum of the American Revolution, and we look forward to continued partnership opportunities in the future. Before I turn it over to my colleague Tyler for an introduction from the museum side of things, I would first like to recognize that the Loeb Drama Center and Oberon, our theatrical buildings, are located on the unceded Indigenous territory of the Massachusetts people, and that I myself am calling in tonight from land belonging to the Wabanaki, Pentucket, and Pencook peoples. One more statement from us at the theater, and that is our audience compact statement that we read at the beginning of every virtual and live event. The A.R.T. is unequivocally opposed to hate and centers anti-racism as a core value. We expect everyone in our community, including our audiences, to uphold these values, and as such, we will not tolerate anti-Blackness or racism of any kind in our buildings, nor in our online events. We aim to create an environment that is uninhabitable to racism and discrimination, where all BIPOC staff, artists, volunteers, audiences, and community members are seen, heard, valued, and provided the opportunity to thrive. This work is only possible when we do it together, and thank you for being our partner in it. Next, I would love to introduce Tyler Putman, the Gallery Interpretation Manager at the Museum of the American Revolution, to come on screen. Tyler, how are you?
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for having us tonight. I am so excited to join you and to welcome everyone virtually into the Museum of the American Revolution. I am here inside one of our galleries. In fact, within our current special exhibition, which is called When Women Lost the Vote, a Revolutionary Story, 1776 to 1807. And behind me is a really stunning gown that we're going to explore in detail later in this program. But I wanted to take just a moment to tell you about the museum. We're a relatively new museum. We opened in 2017 right here in Old City, Philadelphia. And I'd love to know in the chat if folks have visited the museum, if they've engaged with our online resources. Feel free to use that to socialize with us or with each other. And we're just really delighted to be in the business of, not unlike A.R.T., telling surprising, moving stories. In our case, we investigate the diverse people, the complex events that started America's ongoing experiment with liberty, equality, and self-government. And I'm just delighted today to engage in such a great conversation with amazing folks like Emilio and Alex and to tell you about this gown. And I'll let you know that at the end of the program, we're going to share a survey. So please do take the time to tell us what you thought and what you want to see more of.
Amazing. Thank you, Tyler. That's fantastic. Before we launch into our program, I just have a little bit of Zoom housekeeping to review before we bring our panelists on screen. And that's first, our discussion will take approximately 45 to 50 minutes because we've got a lot to cram in today, but we will reserve the last 10 to 15 minutes of the hour for audience Q&A. So if you have questions for our panelists at any time, please submit them using the Q&A feature, which is located at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. Now, please note that that is different from the chat feature. So if you want the best chance at us answering your question, be sure to submit using the Q&A feature. All right. That's about it for Zoom housekeeping. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists, Alex Myers and Emilio Sosa, to join us on screen. Alex and Emilio, hello. Hi, friends. So lovely to see you tonight. Great. Let's do some introductions. Alex, let's have you go first.
Excellent. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Myers, and I'm an English teacher at Phillips Exeter Academy. In addition to teaching, I'm also a writer of fiction, mostly, and I have several novels out if you're interested. And on top of that, one of my great passions in life is working with schools to be more gender inclusive. I work to support transgender and non-binary students and the teachers and administrators who work with them.
I love that. Thank you, Alex. Emilio?
Hi, my name is Emilio Sosa. I am a New York City-based costume and fashion designer. I just love what I do, and I'm very happy to be here. I think 1776 is a great show, but also to frame it with gender, women, clothing, it's really going to be really interesting. So I'm just happy to be here.
Oh, we're so happy to have you, Emilio. So to start the conversation a little bit, Alex, we're going to go to you first. Can you tell us a little bit about Deborah Sampson as a figure and what makes you so interested in her story?
I would be utterly delighted to do so. And I'm going to share my screen to get that story started. I'll begin by saying that I am an ancestor. Deborah Sampson is an ancestor of mine, rather. And I began researching her story in great depth after having heard it from my grandmother when I was a small child. So it is a story that I knew for much of my life and love a great deal. So I'm going to start with this 1797 portrait of Deborah and take you through a little bit of her life. She was born in 1760 in the small town of Plimpton, Massachusetts, not far from where the Pilgrims got off the Mayflower. And she was one of 7 children. When she was about 4 years old, her father abandoned her family, leaving her mother to support 7 kids, which was utterly impossible. So very quickly, Deborah's mom got rid of her. First, she put her out. That's the colonial term for foster care. And she served a widow for a few years. And when that widow died, Deborah was sold into indentured servitude. She served the Thomas family in Middleborough, Massachusetts. And when she was freed of her indentures at the age of 18, she decided to support herself, which was a very unique and one might even say rebellious position for a young woman to take. Women at the time were property. They were owned by or governed by their husband, their father, or the master of the household they served. But in 1780, Deborah at 18 said, "I will support myself." And she was able to do so because she could weave. And weaving was a rather lucrative, as things went, career. And so she became an itinerant weaver. She would go around a series of taverns and private houses in the area, and she would weave cloth. And for several years, she supported herself in what was both a remarkable and unremarkable life. A lot of work, a lot of toil, but she was incredibly independent and really remarkably so for the time. One of the hallmarks of this is here in the first recorded instance we have of her name. And this is in 1780, a record not in her own hand, but in somebody else's, of her joining the Baptist Church, which was truly a renegade act. 99.9% of any town in Massachusetts at the time belonged to the Congregational Church. And so this was really gesturing that she was a free and independent woman to join a new church and one that was largely egalitarian at the time. In 1780, again, she was still weaving, and it was in 1782, in the spring of that year, that her life changed dramatically. General George Washington put out a call for troops, for 3 years' men, and though they didn't know it then, it would be the final call of the American Revolution. And all across Massachusetts, very few people signed up, and towns had to offer a huge bounty to get men to sign on. A lot of them had already served or served in militias, which was preferred to the National Army. And so in the town of Middleborough, where Deborah was living, the bounty went to 20 pounds sterling. It's more the money than Deborah had ever seen in her life. So she promptly walked down to the recruiting office, tucked her hair under a cap, stole a set of men's clothes from a house where she knew a servant, and presented herself as Timothy Thayer. Alas, somebody in that little recruiting office recognized her and turned her in to the local police. Then the constable threatened her with arrest. Before he could arrest her, she fled town and began to try to enlist elsewhere. And this is where we get the second instance of Deborah's name in the historical record, when she was excommunicated from the Baptist Church, which she had just joined. And this is a lovely piece of writing And it says, considered the case of Deborah Sampson, a member of this church, who last spring was accused of dressing in men's clothes and enlisting as a soldier in the army. And although she was not convicted, yet was strongly suspected of being guilty, and for some time before behaved very loose and unchristian-like. Fascinating when you stop and think about what she's being accused of. Dressing in men's clothes, which was a crime at the time, and enlisting as a soldier. But really what they're interested in is this loose and unchristian-like behavior. That's where the real guilt lies. And it's no wonder then that Deborah wanted to leave town. She knew what would happen to her reputation if she stuck around. So Deborah fled, and she went from Middleborough down to New Bedford. This is all what she tells us, which may be about as fictional as my novel about her. But she tells us that she went down to New Bedford, thought about being a sailor, went up to Boston. All the news of her life had sprung from Boston. She was fascinated by it, and then began to go town to town asking, how much are you paying for soldiers to join on? She ends up in Bellingham and Uxbridge. She signs on under the name of Robert Shirtliff, and then she's told to meet the company up in Worcester, where they march all the way to West Point. When she gets to West Point, she's actually selected to be in the light infantry, the best of the infantry troops. And so I thought I would share with you a very short contextualizing comment from George Washington, which might help explain why a 22-year-old woman masquerading as a 16-year-old boy would be chosen to be the best of the best. And General George Washington actually court-martialed the colonel who brought in Deborah's recruiting class. And this language reads as a little bit insensitive, though it is historically accurate. So George Washington says in this court-martial, "You brought me in 4 deserters, 2 from the French army and 2 from the English, 3 boys, undersized, a Negro lame in the ankle, and George West, a known idiot." In other words, you have a group of people who were not fit in their opinion, to be soldiers. And I think it's relevant to remember that Deborah was serving with men who were not perhaps the pick of the litter, as it were. And also that's what the officers thought of the men in the army. That's the language they used to describe them. We don't know exactly how Deborah served. This is a much later woodcut of her, and it's evidence of the male gaze on her. This is not at all how she served. She was nowhere near a cannon anywhere. But notice how men are starting to depict her in her uniform, separate from the other ranks of men. And this is the sort of historical lens that's been trained on Deborah for a while. We don't know much about her service. A lot of the records are lost, but she served for about a year and a half and then eventually earned an honorable discharge, at which time she returned to the area where she grew up. And was more or less forced to resume her life as a woman. She married, she had children, but this does not mean that she sort of went quietly and silently into the rest of her life. She remained very independent and active. And in the early 1800s, she began to petition to get her own military pension. She actually had help from Paul Revere, who wrote this letter. And he describes in it, again, that when he went to visit her, that he had formed the idea of a masculine female, the meanest of her sex, but was agreeably surprised to find a small, effeminate woman. Again, talking a little bit about what we think of women who dress as men, what we think of women who are soldiers. And after receiving her pension, which wasn't very much, Deborah thought she would make some more money by going on the road as a lecturer, and she became America's first traveling woman lecturer. She went around New England and upstate New York, and she would give a little talk in a dress on stage about her virtue and her patriotism. Then she'd go backstage, change into her old uniform, and perform the manual exercise of arms, the military drill, right there on stage. And I often say jokingly that I think Deborah was America's first drag act, but I don't actually mean it as a joke. Because if we go to Marge Garber's definition of drag, that drag is somebody who wants to be looked at versus a transgender person who wants to be looked through. I think Deborah very much wanted to be looked at, and she wanted to be looked at in her dress and to say, I am a woman, I'm a mother, I'm a wife. And then she wanted to be looked at in that uniform and said, and I'm also a soldier and a man and completely capable of being both things. So that, in a nutshell, is Deborah Sampson 101.
That's amazing, Alex. Thank you so much. Something that I find really interesting is that I grew up, in fact, not very far from where Deborah Sampson grew up at all. And yet I've known very little about her as a historical figure. So this whole experience was also a learning experience for me. I appreciate it. Emilio, let's hear from you next. I'm going to spotlight you for the group. But Emilio, can we talk a little bit about how Deborah Sampson and maybe other figures like her in the historical record influenced your design perspective while you were working on 1776?
Sure. Well, as everyone knows, it was only men who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And the show is about that signing and how that document came about. So when I got the cast, I have humans who identify as women, non-binary, gender fluid. So I just kept racking my brain. How am I going to dress my actors? But finding about Deborah, that she was a soldier and she wore men's clothing, really just opened up the floodgates for me. It just made it possible for me to really just focus on creating the characters and not so much on the gender, because Deborah broke the mold. She was historical. We have images, or we have documentation of what she might have looked like. So for me as a costume designer, once you find any piece of history or research, then you can really just use it and open up your imagination. So finding out about Deborah really just made me become a better designer for the show, because I wasn't just thinking about how do I dress these people to look like men from 1776. Now I could just really concentrate on who were these people and what are the characteristics and what do they bring to the table.
That's awesome. I think that actually we have some images that you provided to us of some sort of general costume and clothing ideas of 18th century women's and men's fashion. And I'm wondering if we could maybe look at that together and talk a little bit about what sort of inspires you or what's striking you about the clothing and the difference between the clothing for the two genders.
Well, as you can see, for the men, fashion in the Americas at that time, which kind of still today, it's really influenced by Europe. France primarily. Even today, some of the biggest names in fashion are European houses. America really didn't have a fashion sense of its own until really the 1940s, when the designer Claire McCardle started what is called American sportswear, which is not what you think of sportswear like being athletic or sports. Sportswear refers to pieces like pants, skirts, dresses, blouses. It wasn't just like evening gowns and fancy dress. So as you can see, the men even then were very, very fashionable. The men, I think, were considered the peacocks of that era. So they wore fancier clothing. Although men wore different things depending on the region, it is known that the Northeast, the people from the Northeast, were more modest in their dress. So the colors were darker, the fabrics were more homespun. And then our Southern gentlemen wore bright colors, more satins, lace, ruffles. They were more ornamentation, while in the Northeast, it was more utilitarian for the men. So there's a mix of that within the show. And for the women, women's fashion through history until 1920, when Gabrielle Coco Chanel took women out of corsets, were bound. If you think about it, 99% of the fashion was created by men for women. That's where you got the corset. That's where you got the hoop skirts. It wasn't about comfort. It had very little regard to the human being inside the clothing. Although it's beautiful to look at, but you can see by the shapes that these were not comfortable clothing to live in. Also, women weren't expected to do a lot unless depended on the social class. But only women who had the means were wearing these amazing fancy clothing. But if you can see just by these images, the waist is pinned in. You got paniers, which is like a corset that gives the skirt a lot of volume. So once again, it was men dictating how women dress as a way of controlling them during the time. And like I said, that didn't really start to change until 1920s when Gabrielle Coco Chanel started that whole dressing knitwear where she got rid of the corsets. She got rid of all the fanciness. It was easy, breezy clothing that women can wear. And that really catapulted the 20s. So if you look at the fashion from the 20s, they're all really like straight shifts with a lot of decorations. The waist is not accentuated. The bust is not accentuated. Chanel wanted to liberate. She said, I wanted to liberate women out of the corset. And the men were the ones who invented the corset to begin with. So fashion has a lot of history, but it also has that aspect of it where it could be an oppressive art form.
We've talked, and I've talked with, friends, family. Clothing is often used as a tool of self-expression. As a costume designer, how do you see costume design helping the characters that you put on stage and dress on stage express really fundamentally who they are without having to explain verbally who they are?
Well, I don't even think you have to go. I can go into the theater and to the theatrical world and say it, but as human beings, well, not in the Zoom world. Now that we're in Zoom world, everything is from the waist up. So, it changes the dynamic. But the moment you wake up in the morning and you select what you're going to put on, you're already telling a story. It may not be conscious to you, but to someone you come in contact with, someone who looks at you on the screen, you're already projecting something without having to say anything. And that to me is what costuming is for me. My job or my goal is when an actor makes an entrance, I need the audience to understand who this character is just by the way they wear their clothing. So I grew up working in commercials for Spike Lee, and he was really the one who taught me. Because, I come from fashion history. I want to do details. I want everything perfect. And Spike would always say to me, less is more, just be more specific. So you need to know who the character is within the first 15 seconds of that actor on stage. And that is achieved by whether it's the color they're wearing, whether it's the fabrication. A worker would have linen, cottons, wools, while let's say someone fancier would have satins, lace, beading. Those little things really, really automatically we're trained subconsciously to see wealth in shiny, bright colors and poverty in browns and sepias and earth tones. So those are little costume fashion tricks. But for me, when I design, I don't really I don't design costumes in air quotes. I design clothing that was worn in a specific period, which means what that to say is I don't put my actors, I don't go through, I do a lot of research, but I do the research so I can understand what the silhouette of the period is. And then I put myself as an artist in that period and then design. So it's not like I'm just copying from paintings and putting it on stage. I'm literally thinking, if I were a designer of that period, what colors were available, what fabrics were available, what techniques were available. And then that informs how I design. So yes, costumes is anything that you put on a stage, on screen, film. It's called a costume because it's worn in a theatrical setting, but really it is clothing from a different time. So for me, costumes is a term that's technical, but as an artist, I look at it more as clothing from a different period.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing, Emilio. I'm excited to learn more about this and to see the costumes on stage for 1776, as I'm sure we all are. We are. It's going to be great. I think now it's time to sort of visit over to Tyler in the gallery at the Museum of the American Revolution for a spotlight on Deborah's wedding dress and some other objects we have there. Tyler, how are you?
Great. Yeah, I'm so glad that Emilio and Alex gave us such a great setup and maybe even a transition. I was thinking as Emilio was talking about, if you didn't know you were coming tonight to a program about Deborah Sampson and you saw the gown that's behind me, I want you to imagine the sort of person who's in it. The first impression you get 15 seconds after that person walks onto the stage. Maybe this is a well-to-do colonial woman and she's hosting a tea party, or she's engaged in, a no Stamp Act boycott. But she fits really clearly in a pretty gendered world that we might imagine even from our primary school education about the 18th century. But I want to explode that and tell you that, in fact, as you all know, this is the wedding dress of a wounded Continental Army soldier. And that's one of the most exciting parts of my job, is showing people real things from the 18th century and getting, maybe helping them kind of peel back their preconceptions. Who actually wore this? What was their life like? When this was the only clothing you knew, it was relatively comfortable. If you grew up wearing stays, we might put these stays on and be, shocked. But if Deborah Sampson wore this her whole life, she probably felt pretty excited to wear it. And I wanted to take you guys tonight on an exploration of this gown, which is on loan to us. And you can actually visit it here at the museum until April 25th. It's on loan to us from Historic New England, a really incredible organization. And some of the stuff I'm going to tell you really benefits from the work of a costume historian named Sharon Ann Bernstein, whose work you can find online. So let's take an overall look at this gown. It's an off-white color. It has long sleeves, a relatively narrow waist that then widens quite suddenly into the skirts. It's a printed fabric with blue printed seashells and pine cones and flowers, kind of large scale print on an off-white, maybe linen, it seems like, or possibly a linen cotton mix ground. If you imagine this gown as it first existed, it was probably made around 1775. And below the waist in the front, it would have been open, revealing a separate petticoat. So it was sort of an open robe type gown. And then it seems like in about 1785, it was modified pretty heavily. And the historian Al Young, whose book we just highlighted this past week in our Read the Revolution series, Masquerade, he speculates that this may have originally been a gown that belonged to a woman named Mary Gannett, who was the mother of Benjamin Gannett, who Deborah Sampson marries in 1785 in Massachusetts. And that for Deborah Sampson's wedding, this gown, Mary Gannett by then had died, this gown may have been modified, brought up to the latest fashions and sort of tweaked. So the differences and the subtle hints are really amazing. If we look closely at the waist, for example, we can see that what had once been the sleeve flounces, these sort of decorative elaborations that would have been on the cuff, have been removed from the sleeves. They're out of fashion now, and they've been pieced in along the waist. You can probably make out there's about a 5-inch section of fabric. And what this would have done is lengthen the gown. Deborah Sampson, as best we can tell, was maybe about 5'7", which is probably a little taller than the average woman of the 18th century. So it sort of makes sense that you would want this gown to be, it would need to be longer to fit her. It's been narrowed a little bit in the back, which you can't see, making it a more fashionable silhouette for 1785. And the arms have actually been reshaped, making them a more fashionable shape, but also let out a little bit, perhaps suggesting that Deborah Sampson's arms were also larger than the original wearer. I think one of the really interesting things about this gown is that, as you can see here on the arm and the print, the print is a relatively large scale. It wouldn't have been especially fashionable by 1785. It's probably originally it was a copperplate print, which was a new technology in the 1760s, carving into sheets of copper, printing it onto fabric. But this particular print is more like an upholstery textile, the sort of thing you would have seen on bed hangings or curtains, but printed on a lightweight material, something suitable for making a gown out of. So by 1785, a question you have to ask yourself is this a fashionable gown? I mean, it's been reworked, so it's sort of keeping up with the times in its silhouette. It's custom fit. It's going to fit Deborah Sampson really well. But its print is not maybe the latest fashionable print for her to be wearing at her wedding. So I think it's incredible to have Sampson's wedding gown here because it's the only object that we know of that survives from her life besides the books that she published. But also, even in its own right as an object, it has this multi-layered kind of generational story. And it was preserved lovingly by her descendants. In fact, successive generations actually wore it to social events. You can see photographs of them wearing it to colonial teas in the 20th century. Before it transferred, it was donated to Historic New England just only about 15 years ago. So we are just so excited to have this garment on display, to really have learned a lot about it and to get questions about it. And I'm excited tonight to hear what Emilio and Alex want to know or think about this gown, and also to answer any questions that folks have in the audience.
Awesome. Thank you, Tyler. We have a question in the Q&A that I was going to save for later, but I think I will elevate in this moment because it does feel quite appropriate before we sort of invite Emilio and Alex to share some thoughts and questions. And that is the wedding gown two pieces?
Oh, that's a great question. So the easiest way to think about this gown for us is probably like a two-piece gown. There's sort of a jacket component and a skirt component, but really they're actually pretty much attached to each other. So you would essentially wrap this gown, kind of step into it, and then it closes down the front with a set of hooks and eyes. So it's sort of a one-piece gown, but as the way we think about clothing and the way Emilio certainly can speak to this as well, it kind of strikes us more like it's the upper garment and the lower garment. For them, a gown would have meant this whole ensemble, one thing.
That's interesting. To my very untrained eyes, it does look like a two-piece. So I'm glad that audience member asked that question and we can address it here. Alex and Emilio, I want to make some space for you all to ask any questions, maybe any comments, any aesthetic preferences or dislikes about this dress, anything you'd like to share about this. I'm gonna unmute both of you. There you go. Perfect.
Well, I mean, what's interesting to me is what Tyler said, that this was worn until recently by some of her descendants, and it's still in such amazing condition. Usually, a garment of that color and that fabrication would have had moth damage, discoloration. You would have had all sorts of things that just life happens to clothing. But to see it in this condition, do you know, Tyler, how much restoration went into it to get it ready for display?
That's a great question. So I will tell you that if you looked up close to this garment, it does have a fair amount of sweat stains, for example, which is actually really cool. I mean, you can imagine the bodies that sometimes for costume folks, like that's the most interesting thing. It's like,
I love that. That's real.
It's amazing.
That's real. That's reality.
Yeah, someone actually wore it. And it has been altered in a number of ways. The hem has been let out and taken in for probably different descendants. The hooks and eyes down the front are replacement. But we didn't have to do much conservation to get it in shape for display. Thanks to Historic New England, since it's moved into a museum collection, it's really been well cared for and taken care of. But you're right, to see it, something like this, to actually be able to imagine it on a dress form even versus maybe carefully laid flat. It'll live in a box most of the other times in its future. But it's incredible that it's Deborah Sampson's wedding dress. You can recognize it.
Pretty amazing. I mean, I love historical clothing. The workmanship you can't find today. And just imagine a lot of this stuff, depending on the year before 1846 was when they invented the sewing machine. A lot of this stuff was all done by hand.
That's right. That's a good point. All hand sewn. All hand sewn.
So imagine, now we can run to H&M and buy a t-shirt for $20 that they've made 20,000. And then when you look at a gown or a dress like this, that was handmade, that has survived 100 and something years, it's pretty remarkable, the workmanship. And I think that's what we're losing in the world today. And to see it so well maintained at the museum is pretty spectacular.
I absolutely agree, Emilio. I am not responsible enough to keep a white garment around for more than a couple months, let alone hundreds of years. So imminently impressed. I cannot, actually. No, I really can't. Alex, any thoughts on the dress or any of the associated objects we've got going on with Tyler?
Yeah, I do. I'm struck by how much cloth and clothing is part of Deborah's life. Paul Revere says when he visited her, she took out a piece of linen or lawn that she had woven back when she was a kid and showed it to him because she was so proud. So it's nice that it's a linen dress, and I wonder, how she felt about the fabric itself because she was a weaver. And I also wonder, and I don't know if you know this, Tyler, was this her only nice dress? Did she wear it for her wedding and then put it away, or did she wear it to church and to other occasions throughout her life?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't know. We know that the family story says that this was the wedding dress, that, it was sort of, that's very clearly fixed to it. And we also know that stylistically that makes sense. If the family said this was a wedding dress and it was like a dress that looked like it was from 1795, we would be kind of skeptical, but it does look about like a kind of fashionable 1785 gown. Most women in her social class would have had multiple gowns, but certainly not, an enormous number. And as far as quality, this gown is definitely a nice gown, but it's not, a silk ball gown. And I think that maybe speaks as much to Deborah's social strata, which I know you can speak about, Alex, as anything else, that she was sort of the type of woman who this might have been the nicest gown she had, even if other women of the time had far nicer gowns in their collections.
Right.
It's an amazing piece. And Tyler, I know that you've got some other fun things in that display over behind you. So I'm wondering if we could maybe take a peek at those, not to lead the witness too much. Great.
Yeah, I would love that. I think we can show them with this other camera. We'll see if I can talk you guys through it while we get it activated. But behind me, there are some really incredible documents related to Deborah Sampson's life, which are also on display. We have a diary by a man named Abner Weston, who on January 23rd, 1782, writes about a remarkable incident that happened in his town about how a woman named Deborah Sampson had attempted to enlist and then been found out. And we know, as Alex pointed out, that Deborah Sampson tried to enlist, failed once, but that was her own account. And this is the first time, this newly discovered diary, that we've ever had firsthand evidence kind of corroborating this story and giving someone else's perspective. What did Abner Weston, a farmer, a soldier himself, what did he think? He gives us just about one line, and then he goes back to talking about the weather. So we have that amazing diary on display. You can see it on the right-hand side of the screen. And we also have a letter from another revolutionary soldier writing about how a woman was discovered dressed as a man in their camp, dressed as a soldier, and was drummed out of camp, which was kind of like a gauntlet of soldiers who would line up and watch someone get publicly punished. And they drummed her out to the tune of the Horrors March, which was a disgraceful tune. Wow. Because in the 18th century, this was, as much as we Revere and others praised Deborah Sampson for her glorious service, in many ways it was a really transgressive act. It was something that was seen as dangerous, as risque, as sort of destroying the social order. So Deborah Sampson kind of lucked out because she was found out by the right people and then celebrated later, whereas this woman, found out right in the midst of the war, goes down as a villain in disgrace. And we don't even know her name. The soldier who wrote that letter doesn't record her name either.
Wow. Oh, thank you for sharing those additional objects. It makes a little history nerd in my heart very, very happy. For the second to last portion of the hour, just to sort of have a bigger group discussion about some of the topics we've discussed, it's incredible to approach the idea of gender in history from these different lenses that we bring to the table. Alex, you as a fiction writer, Emilio as a costume designer, and Tyler, you as a historian. So we've got sort of an overarching theme of dress, clothing, and gender identity kind of threaded throughout this conversation. And Emilio, I think we touched on it a little bit earlier today in this conversation, but I'm wondering if we all as a group can sort of discuss the differentiation between dress and clothing and what we think of as costume, and maybe how Deborah viewed her clothing at various points in her life as either clothing or costume or something completely different. Alex, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that handy.
I do, and I'd add one more word and be curious to hear what Emilio thinks of that word, and that word is disguise. Mm-hmm. Because I think what I tried to communicate in my writing and how I understand gender expression and the many transgender people's experience is there's a time when you put on clothing and it feels like you're hiding something. And there's a time when you put on clothing and you feel like you're revealing something. And there's a time when you put on clothing and you're not sure which one it is, and it can transfer from one to the other. And I bet when Deborah put that uniform on for the first time, it felt a little scary and a little exciting, and it probably was a disguise. It kept her from being arrested. But I also bet there was a time when Robert Shurtleff, Deborah's name when in the Army, felt like this was exactly who he was supposed to be, and this was his uniform. So I'm curious about those lines.
Yeah. You know what? I like the word disguise more than costume, because costume to me has a, like you're pretending that play, like you're pretending to play something, while a disguise, you're actually living within the realms of what you're wearing. Yeah. Versus a costume is something you put on to like fool people, maybe something that has more of a jovial sense, while disguise has more of an intentional thing. And I think for her, wearing the men's clothing was very intentional. She knew what she was doing and why she needed to wear the clothing. So definitely, I mean, like I said before, clothing identifies you. People make perceptions about you from what you're wearing, either consciously or unconsciously. We all do it, you know? So we're just wired that way. We're wired to look at people and make judgments on the visual presentation. So you can use it to your benefit, or people use it to your destruction. It just depends. But clothing is a powerful tool. It's one of the most, I think, powerful expressions that we all as humans around the world share without even knowing.
Absolutely. Something else that I'd like to touch on, and again, this has been a thread throughout the evening in our discussions prior to this event, but I would love to talk about the fact that, like so many women in the historical record, Deborah Sampson's story is often retold by men. Can we talk a little bit about why that is and how you think that might impact the public's perception and understanding of her story? Alex, we can start with you again.
Sure. Yes, her story is told by men, and the closest we get to a personal account from her is as told to a ghost-written memoir called The Female Review, which is more fictional than the novel I wrote about her. She makes up a lot of stories to make herself seem more important than she is. And I think a lot of the work of the men who tell stories about Deborah and other women who, and I'll put this in quote, cross-dressed, is a story that tries to make her palatable and sensational at once. So they're trying to fit her into a trope that's familiar and appropriate. And we know stories like Mulan is a classic. Hannah Snell would have been another person that Deborah would have read the memoir of. And Joan of Arc, who had a slightly different end, but still kind of fits the trope. But generally speaking, men want the women to be daring and exciting and courageous and fight on behalf of their family and country, but not themselves, and then go back to their regular sphere. They have to go back to being wives and mothers and daughters and good, pious girls and women, or you get Joan of Arc and you're burned at the stake. So that's how the men tend to see the women, that they need to be contained by narrative and by the proper sphere eventually.
Right. And like what I mentioned before, I would say 90% of the fashion designers throughout history, even today, are men. And they are designed for women. So they already have an idea of what they want to present, how they think women should look. So I always say it's about control. It's about control. And you can control someone by what options you give them to wear. Like, it wasn't until 1940s, Claire McCardle, who really started sportswear where women were wearing pants. And that was an offshoot of the war. Women had to go into the workplace. So prior to that, very few women wore pants. And the ones that wore pants or wore men's clothing were more performers. You have Josephine Baker was known to wear a tuxedo. Melina Dietrich is famous for wearing men's clothing. And then you have Katharine Hepburn was very famous for wearing pants and men's shirts. So men gave women permission to be who they wanted to be through the fashion industry. And that's always been the case. That's why so many women who are now into fashion really are very pioneers in what women wear because they understand. You know, I mean, when I studied fashion design at school, the teachers would always ask, so what does your woman do? You know, like, where does she work? What does she do? Not, you know, instead of saying, okay, this is what is needed for this event. It was more, I had to put myself in a woman's head to design for women, but it wasn't women designing for themselves. So it was always very strange for me when they would ask me. I was like, I don't care what she does. If she likes it and she can afford it, then she should wear it. Versus, oh, she had to wear this because this is what society had in mind. But it's just interesting how fashion really puts you in a box if you allow it to.
Yes, and I never really quite thought about it that way before, Emilio. So thank you for sharing. And as a woman who is a very staunch advocate of pants, albeit of the very soft pajama-like variety, I'm grateful that transition happened in the 1940s. And I have one final question for our panel before we turn it over to audience Q&A. And this is something that we haven't touched on in our discussion, but we sort of really highlighted when we were advertising this event. So we are hosting this event today, April 7th, for a very specific reason. This is the anniversary of Deborah Sampson's wedding, which took place on April 7th, 1785. And I'm curious if anyone really has any thoughts on how that's resonating with them, or why, you know, the date of her wedding and her wedding dress are the things that we're really uplifting in this conversation, understanding that they are not complete, holistic depictions of her as a person. Alex, we'll start with you again. We'll make the round robin again.
Sure. Yeah, there's an irony in it because I think that Deborah was not happy in her marriage from what we know. She was certainly impoverished in it. She had 3 children with Benjamin Gannett, which was very, very small number. So there were rumors around town that she had cut him off after 3. And she adopted more children into her family after that. From what I can tell and what people who saw her speak also record, the wedding was not the highlight of her life. And by having the dress there as sort of the one item that's associated with her, it can give the impression that this was the moment. And I think that's a mistake. I like much better to think of the day of her enlistment, even perhaps the day of her discharge, as the moments she might point to as this is what defines me.
Thank you. And Emilio, as a costume designer and stylist, not as a historian, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about wedding dresses in general and sort of how they're used as a symbol for people globally in the past and the present.
Well, prior to, I think it was Queen Victoria, women didn't wear white for the wedding. They wore their nicest dress, whatever that was. But I think Queen Victoria had a white gown because she wanted to stand out amongst all of her guests. And once she wore white for her wedding, that's how you got the white wedding and the whole virginal aspect of the color. You know, so also it's like going to what Alex said, Deborah probably would have loved to be remembered for her being in the Revolutionary War, her soldier aspect of her career. But the irony and the universe, what we remember her by is her wedding dress, a dress, something that she fought against and went against the culture. And then that's what we have from her. But I think it's great. I think it just shows the arc that she had to travel to be who she wanted to be. You know, that society put this dress on her so they can make her more palatable for everyone. While I think what makes her really special is the fact that she was a woman who fought in the Revolutionary War at a time when women didn't leave the house, basically. You know, they did what they were told. So, you know, the wedding day also is Billie Holiday's birthday. That's why.
I did not know that.
So it's a double
multitudes. Yeah.
You know, 2 amazing American women were born on this day. Billy born and Deborah married, but two significant days. That's why this day is special for me.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. I will now always associate this with Billie Holiday's birthday, which I quite like. So that's great. If you can believe it, we have less than 10 minutes left and the Q&A is very full. So I do apologize for everyone. I do not think we're unfortunately going to get to answer everyone's question, but I will do my best to sort of shuffle us through. So looking through this, interesting question that I think, Alex, is likely aimed for you at looking at Deborah's historical past. And let me just find it again. I'm so sorry, I lost it for a whole minute. But the name that she assumed when she enlisted in the Army. Do we have an idea of why she used the name Robert Shirtliff? This person is saying that they believe that she was related to a family of Shirtliffs, Plymouth and Marshfield, Massachusetts. Do you think that inspired her to choose that name, or was there some other source of inspiration?
Both times that she enlisted, it seems that she chose names that were local, common, and not associated with anyone who would ask her about her own town. So when she enlists, I think she's choosing surnames that would have connected her to a broad range of people, so that she could say, "Oh, I'm not from the Plimpton Shirtliffs. I'm from the Duxbury Shirtliffs," or whatever the case may be. So that is my best guess. Was she was just picking something like Smith or Jones of the day.
That makes sense. That's fantastic. We've got many other interesting questions. This is, I think, for all of you, because this is sort of a question that is rooted more in creativity and some historical fact, but I think more interpretation. So when the war was over, when Deborah left the Army, when she returned to life as a woman, how do you think she was accepted by her community, her church, and maybe other women that she encountered on a day-to-day basis? And again, this is not a historical fact question, I think, so much as people are just really interested in what you think may have happened for all three of you.
I think Alex would have more.
Great.
Or Tyler, or more.
Alex, Tyler?
I'll just say quickly that she was called the old soldier by her neighbors. And she would wear her old Continental Army jacket out when she was plowing the fields. She was a poor woman. She worked her own fields. And everyone knew the story. It wasn't something she hid, and she told those stories. So I think they were stiffly proud of her as a local sort of renegade, even though, as we said, larger society would have condemned her acts. The fact she went on the road shows that she was celebrated, but she's the exception. Yeah.
The old soldier. I like that. A couple more fantastic questions here. We've got someone in the chat, actually, but I do want to lift this up because I think it's incredibly interesting. Do any of you think that she was able to get away with passing herself off as a man because people simply could not imagine the idea of a woman dressing as a man? In other words, is it beyond the realm of possibility for viewers to have seen her as a woman in men's clothing and allowed it to sort of happen and pass? What do you think?
What a great question.
It's such a good question. I know it's really creative, which is why I picked it. I know it's a little more difficult to answer than some of the others, but I'm really interested in hearing all of your thoughts.
I think
they were at war, and you're probably just trying to stay alive and hoping that the soldier next to you is going to cover you. You know what I mean? Your survival is survival. So I'm sure they might have maybe her hands were a little smaller. Maybe she was a little more feminine. They didn't care as long as they can shoot the musket and the bayonets. I think to me, it might have been more of we're all here to survive and get through this. We can get to know each other afterwards. while we're on this field fighting and shooting, it's every man for themselves. We're all in it together, in a sense.
Great. Tyler, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to add, it's hard for us to imagine a world that once existed in which the packaging you came in, no one ever crossed that boundary. Or it maybe happens so rarely that it might be for like a theatrical play, but like every person you saw wearing breeches was someone you identified as a man, and every person you saw wearing a gown was someone you identified as a woman. So the extent to which you would even have analyzed facial features, like it might have been so foreign to you, it might not even have occurred to you that a soldier would be a biological woman. You might just never have, been able to penetrate that layer. Whereas we sort of, close our less gendered than they were in the 18th century, and were like ready to say like, quote, "What are you?" I think for them it was much more fixed to the clothing someone walked by you in. Right. But I don't know, Alex, do we know a little bit about, or maybe we don't know as much as we like about, even like how she managed to, live life as a woman in military camps?
Right. And I will push back just a little bit in two ways. The autobiography of Hannah Snell, who was a 1740s woman who served as a Royal Marine, so on board a British naval vessel, dressed as a man, was a hugely popular book in the early American Republic, colonial and early American Republic. So that narrative circulated, and there's a law against women dressing as men. We don't tend to make laws for problems that don't exist. We do occasionally, but if there's a law about it, it means it's happening. And it's one more way that they're trying to control women. That law, I'll just say for the record, stayed on the books of the state of Massachusetts until 2006. 2006. Wow. Male impersonation was still illegal. I was threatened with it myself. Anyway, but these are real laws, and they actually enforced them. So it does mean that some women were dressing as men. Why? Because that's how you get power. Why? Because that's how you get freedom. It might be more of a temporary disguise. You might put on men's clothes to leave town because your husband is abusing you, and go 3 towns away because women weren't allowed to travel alone, take off those men's clothes and never wear them again. But even that would have been illegal to do.
I did not know that Massachusetts had that law in the book till 2006. That actually just really shocked me. But Massachusetts, man, you find things every day. We've got time for maybe one more question. I try to fit 2 in there, so please forgive me, museum colleagues, if we go a couple minutes over the hour. But we have a great question for Emilio. I think you touched on this a little bit earlier in the presentation, but could you talk a little bit about what you now know about Deborah Sampson and other figures like her in the historical record is sort of influencing and shaping your costume design?
I think what Deborah Sampson did for me as a costume designer.
Oh no, Emilio! Oh no, Emilio was frozen. We were about to get a really good soundbite. I know it.
I'm here.
You're here? Okay, good. We lost you for a second. I'm so sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
It's that what she did, her life story, her history, what it did was it gave me a passport to dress my cast according to historically correct. I don't have to think about, is it a female? How do I put a woman in a men's costume? I don't have to do that because Deborah Sampson proved that women were doing it at the time that the show takes place. So as long as my costume is period correct, then it can go on anyone in the cast. Mm-hmm. And that's what she did for me in this show. So that was huge, because at the beginning when I first got the show and I kept thinking, okay, how am I going to do this? What is considered? What can I pass? Do I have to make the vest a certain shape? Do I have to account for certain things? But I don't have to, because Deborah did it. And there's history. And it's, thanks to Alex and Tyler, we have things that I can, if anyone said anything to me, oh, that could not happen, I can go, wait. Hey, wait a minute. Deborah Sampson wore this and blah, 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 blah. So really what she did was give me the okay to design this period correct.
I love that.
And concentrate on that and not the gender of the person wearing it.
Beauty of this collaboration of folks on this screen. It makes me very happy.
Yes.
Forgive me, everyone. We're going to go a couple minutes over, but this is such an interesting question, and I really do want to lift it up for all of our panelists. This person is saying, it's entirely possible that Deborah Sampson identified as a trans man, a person who was non-binary, or as genderqueer, although maybe this terminology did not exist yet. The identities themselves all did still exist. Do you think that people today should be using the all-inclusive they-them pronoun or another series of gender non-binary pronouns when referring to Sampson instead of she/her, which is what I've been doing throughout the course of the program?
I stick to both she and he in my novel, and I make it clear that when Deborah was in the military, he went by Robert. He was apparently called Rob by his colleagues, and he definitely went by he pronouns. But otherwise, she lived as a woman and went by she. And so that feels really authentic to me. And what I really dislike in terms of misgendering Deborah is when we refer to her when she was a soldier. Well, I don't know that she ever was, but I'm pretty sure that Robert Shurtleff was a really good soldier. So that's the distinction.
Right. I agree with Alex. I think that's the best way that I will correct myself. I know I've been gender identifying her as she, but I think Alex makes a great point. When she was the soldier, he was the soldier. And when she wasn't the soldier, then she was Deborah. So I think the he, she is how I will from now on reference her in my speaking, because she is going to be very instrumental when I design his costume.
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you both for sharing. I was just a question. It came in late, and I really wanted to lift up. So thank you all. Thank you all so much for being here with me today. And Tyler, I'm going to turn it over to you for the end of our evening.
Yeah, and I would love to just acknowledge one last question from the Q&A, which is from Lava, age 6, who wanted to know, did anyone ever find out that Robert Shurtleff was a girl? And I wondered if, Alex, you might just want to give Lava a few breadcrumbs to follow that question.
Yes. Robert Shurtleff was discovered to be female-bodied by a doctor, a wonderful name of Barnabas Binney, when Deborah fell ill. So there was this discovery towards the end of the war, and it's something you can read about in multiple sources, and is really fascinating to see how this doctor reacted to that news, and then how the generals in the army also reacted.
Thanks. And, for all of our audience, Lava and otherwise, there are some great books, starting with Revolutionary about Deborah Sampson's life, but also young adult and kids books. There's some great material online. We've been sharing a ton of material in the chat. So there are a lot of really exciting ways to continue this exploration if you want to know more about Deborah Sampson and women like her, whose names and faces we don't have in the record. And of course, if you want to visit us at the museum, this gown right here, the real thing, will be here until April 25th, along with some really incredible other objects we're using to tell stories of all sorts of different women, including ones who voted in New Jersey between 1776 and 1807, a largely forgotten story that on what Susan B. Anthony called the sacred soil of New Jersey, women could vote for 30 years, over a century before the passage of the 19th Amendment. So there's always cool things to explore and learn here at the museum and online. And on behalf of all of us here, I just wanted to thank A.R.T. and Alex and Emilio for an amazing conversation. To everyone in the audience, I cannot wait to see 1776 and to read Alex's next work.